40 seconds decided everything. That's exactly how long it took for 10,000 tons of fresh fill to turn into liquid mush and slide into the river, blackened by the downpour, without a single explosion, without warning, just layer after layer, as if the earth itself was tired of bearing someone else's arrogance on its shoulders. The floodlights on Widow's Ridge darted across the slope in jagged white spots, capturing a scrap of tarpaulin flapping in the wind like a wounded bird, a grater stuck up to its headlights, or men with shovels running toward a place where there was nothing left to save. Rain had been pouring for 3 days, cold March rain, smelling of wet iron, diesel fuel, and that unmistakable scent of torn earth. Somewhere below, at the water's edge, Foreman Wes Tilley shouted through a megaphone for everyone to back away from the edge, a cry drowned out by the low guttural rumble of subsiding ground, a sound that made the eyes of men who had worked on the site for 20 years go black. "Get back! Everyone get back from the embankment!" Tilley's voice broke. The megaphone crackled and choked by the rain. Calvin Drake, the consortium's chief engineer, stood knee-deep in icy mud and watched as the blueprint he'd spent 2 years creating, calculations, sleepless nights, thousands of pages of approvals, transformed before his eyes into a disaster map. Tonight, according to the schedule, which held the entire Harrison Trust bond tranche, the embankment was supposed to receive the first layer of concrete for the bridge's supports. Instead, it was receiving the river, and the river took it willingly, without resistance, as it takes everything built in haste. And on the other bank, where a limestone bend barely emerged from the seething water, the gray, motionless back of a sleeping beast against the backdrop of all this chaos, stood one man. Dan Corwin held no radio, no blueprints, no megaphone. Only his father's old kerosene lantern, glowing steadily, without flickering or flickering, was the only steady light in a valley where everything else was swaying and shaking. Rain trickled from the brim of his hat and dripped from his chin, but he didn't move. The water beneath his boots flowed as it had for probably 1,000 years, calmly along its ancient bed, without touching a single stone in the foundation he'd laid here 8 months ago, back when the whole town was convinced Corwin the mechanic had bought himself a plot of stupidity for $8,000. You know, I often think back to that night. Dozens of people with spotlights, tractors, bank connections, and investors' signatures on valuable paper, and one man with a flashlight, standing on land that everyone else dismissed as a useless swamp. Silence sometimes speaks louder than the screams of an entire construction site, and that night on Salt Fork it was plain to see, to anyone who dared to look up from their own panic. If one could have risen above the valley and looked down on it that night, it would have seemed like a wound in the state's flesh. A string of emergency lights stretched for miles along the highway. Farmers from neighboring plots stood by their fences in raincoats, wrapped in blankets, silently watching as a $30 million government project, the largest in the county's history, sinked into the river before their eyes. Somewhere downstream, in small towns like Harrison Hollow, people were already calling each other on the phone, whispering the news, as if afraid the river itself would hear and be offended. By morning, the depth of the breach became clear. The consortium had lost more than just the embankment. It had lost nearly $2 million in earthworks overnight, and, even worse for the bank, it had lost time that the bondholders simply didn't have. The tranche had to be closed by the end of the quarter, or the entire financing for the Salt Fork Bridge would be up in the air. Hollis Bragg, the bank's president, learned of the collapse at 4 in the morning, awakened from his bed by a phone call. He remained silent for a long moment, listening to Drake's report, his voice trembling with cold, and then uttered a single name, the name of the man he had laughed at the auction 8 months earlier, unaware that this laughter would cost him dearly. But to understand how mechanic Dan Corwin found himself standing on the only solid piece of land in the entire valley that rainy night, while everything else was crumbling around him, We need to go back 8 months to the day the bank made the only mistake in its history. The auctioneer Cyrus Pell's gavel came down with a dry thud, and the second-floor courtroom of the county courthouse erupted in laughter, that special, condescending laughter that comes from laughing at a man who has just made a fool of himself in front of half the town. 8,000? Pell repeated, not believing his ears, and glanced around the rows of benches as if searching for confirmation that he'd misheard. For Toller's quarry? For a swamp that even cows avoid? Dan Corwin stood in the back row, holding his hand up a little longer than necessary, not out of stubbornness, but because his arm had gone slightly numb with nervousness. He was wearing the same jacket with the frayed elbows he'd worn to work at Hennessy's garage, and his whole appearance was so at odds with the amount he'd just named that the room continued to chuckle for a minute after the hammer had fallen a second time, definitively in his favor. $8,000. All he had. Military savings checks saved from a year and a half in Korea, the proceeds from selling his father's truck, and the very same $300 his late mother kept in a bank under the floorboard, not in Bragg's, because, as she used to say, at least if you keep your money in the floorboard, no one's counting it behind your back. The property was called Toller's Bend, an old limestone quarry on the Salt Fork, abandoned after its owner, Ezra Toller, went bankrupt in '49, trying to extract stone where, according to all those in the know, there was no stone of any value. Solid silt, shale, and water that rose 1.5 feet higher every spring. The bank had repossessed the property, put it up for auction, and was absolutely certain it would buy it back for next to nothing through a frontman. This had been done before. Hollis Bragg knew the value of land better than anyone in the area, and he knew exactly which pieces of it would soon be needed for a project the town hadn't even imagined yet. Bragg sat in the front row, his legs crossed, his narrow, clean-shaven face expressing nothing but a slight, almost paternal pity. "Son," he said quietly as Dan passed by, signing papers with the clerk. "For that money you could have bought a lot in Harrison Hollow with a real house. Instead, you bought yourself knee-deep mud and mosquitoes for the summer. But that's your call." The courtroom chuckled again. Dan said nothing. In the far corner by the corner, a young woman in a formal gray suit, local attorney Ruth Calloway, who had dropped into the courtroom on another matter, looked up from her papers for a moment and looked at him more closely than mere curiosity would have warranted. Something about the way he calmly endured the laughter from the entire courtroom didn't fit the usual picture of the town eccentric who'd simply thrown his money away. He tucked the receipt into his inside pocket, next to the worn leather notebook he'd carried with him almost constantly for the past month. The field journal of his father, Silas Corwin, a mason and self-taught surveyor who'd worked for county road contractors for 30 years. The notebook, covered in small, cramped handwriting, was a jumble of tool bills, masonry sketches, and on one of the last pages, dated back to 1938, a short note about how, beneath the silt at the bend near Toller, lay a monolith, like the ridge, only deeper and harder. His father wrote this without any pomp, casually, the way one might write about the weather. He himself had made this note while surveying the bank for a bridge that was never built. Dan had read this page for the first time a month ago, when he was sorting through his father's things in the attic. And since then he had been unable to shake the thought that beneath the stupidity that the whole town laughed at might be hiding the only truly solid thing in this valley. Bragg, of course, knew nothing of the notebook. He dismissed Corwin's purchase that same evening, turning his attention to a far more pressing matter, a phone call to the State Highway Office, which was just finishing the preliminary survey of a new route through the county. No one in the courtroom, including the banker himself, suspected that the agency's engineers had already marked on the working map, with a simple blue pencil, without ceremony, the only point 10 miles upriver and downriver where the bedrock allowed for the installation of bridge piers without months of stabilization. The point was called Option A, Taller Bend. The smell came before the sound, a cold, mineral, stone-like scent, unlike anything else, revealed for the first time in 30 years. Dan stood ankle-deep in icy slush at the bottom of an old quarry, holding a chunk of rock he'd just dug up with a drill from 9 feet below. Gray, dense, veined with quartz, exactly what his father had described in his notebook as a monolith. Not shale, not silt, not the vain hope of a mad mechanic. Stone. The last 3 weeks had been identical, like twins. Rise at 5 before dawn, while the city slept and couldn't catch him at work. A hand auger, a crowbar, a bucket, and an old water pump borrowed for $5 from Hennessy the mechanic, that was Dan's entire arsenal, as he probed the bend foot by foot, checking against his father's grid of measurements. 10 steps along the bank, auger down, recording the depth, 10 more steps. By midday his arms were numb from the cold and the weight, and his back ached so much that he could only straighten up in the evening, clutching the shovel handle like an old man clutching a cane. Father's notebook wasn't just a record, it was a system. Silas Corwin marked out the shoreline with a 10-foot grid, and at each grid point he noted the depth to solid ground, 4 feet here, 6 there, and at the very bend, where the river made a sharp turn, the depth suddenly dropped to 1.5 feet and stayed there for almost 40 yards. It was this section that Father called the monolith. Dan drilled 23 holes with that drill before he trusted his own hands more than someone else's 30-year-old notebook entries. The numbers matched almost everywhere, differing by no more than a few inches. By the end of the 3rd week, not a single callus remained on his palms. The skin peeled off and grew back in layers, like bark on an old tree. In the evenings, he rubbed his hands with grease he'd picked up from Hennessy's garage, and tried not to think about the fact that if his father's notebook was wrong about even one thing, he'd be left penniless and without a single chance of getting anything back for his stupidity. From the road that ran along the shore, everyone could see his work. Orville Hatch, a farmer from a neighboring plot, slowed his truck almost every day to shout something like, "Hey, Quarry Corvin, found any gold?" and drove off, pleased with his own joke, before Dan could respond. Kids from town circled the road deliberately to watch the eccentric digging a hole without any sense. None of them questioned why a man who had already scraped together $8,000 for the purchase wasted every free minute on what they considered pointless labor. In early April, Dan decided to try his first real test. He built a small dam out of old boards and clay, a low, temporary one, barely knee-high, across a narrow channel to see how the water would react around a bend before laying the real foundation upstream. The dam wasn't a defense, but a question posed to the river using the cheapest material available. Dan needed to see with his own eyes how fast the water was eroding the clay around the bend, and which way the silt was carried, up the bend or down toward the bridge, which so far existed only on a blue pencil line at the state office. Knowing this, he could calculate the angle and height of the real embankment so that the water would work for him, not against him, the simple but merciless physics his father had drilled into him since childhood. Don't fight the river, son. Find out where it wants to flow and build it so that it is beneficial for it to flow exactly there. The river responded quickly. 4 days later, an early spring downpour occurred, not the one that would come a month later, but a modest precursor, and the makeshift dam didn't hold for even an hour. The clay washed away, the boards were carried away, and the pit at the bottom of the quarry was flooded to the brim with murky brown water. Hutch, driving by the next morning, stopped his truck on the side of the road and laughed for a long time from the cab before shouting to Dan, who was shoveling mud with a shovel, "I told you so! This land loves nothing but frogs!" News of the failure reached town faster than the mud on Dan's boots had time to dry. The cafe on the main street joked about it over breakfast for the next 3 days, that the eccentric mechanic hadn't even lasted until the first rain. They thought they were seeing the end of the story. They didn't realize they were only observing the first inherently weak layer of defense. The very dam Dan had deliberately built from the cheapest materials he could find, to understand exactly how the water would behave around the bend, before spending his energy and his last savings on a foundation that would last not just one season, but a lifetime. In the interests of the public development of the district, and in accordance with the right of compulsory purchase of land for state needs, Dan read the government proposal 3 times before he got the gist of it. The bank and the state office demanded that he sell Toller's Bend for $2,000, a quarter of what he had paid for it himself, or face legal action, where the land would be forcibly seized, with compensation determined by a commission appointed by the same county where Hollis Bragg served on the Board of Trustees. The letter had been sitting on the desk for a week, next to a statement from the Toller heirs, Ezra's 2 adult sons, who had been convinced by the bank's lawyer that the auction had been conducted with procedural violations and that the sale could be contested. If the court ruled in their favor, the land would simply be returned to the county trust, bypassing Dan entirely, and then there wouldn't even be any need to argue about compensation. The $8,000 would vanish as if they had never existed. Bragg showed up at Hennessy's garage in person the day after the letter was delivered, unusually without a secretary or a smile. He paused at the entrance, not going inside to avoid getting machine oil on his boots, and began speaking as if continuing a long-standing conversation. "You have 30 days, son," he said, tapping the folded newspaper against his palm. "Take 2,000 and leave this earth amicably before the court decides everything for you, and then you won't get a cent at all. I'm offering you a way out that you won't have in a month." Hennessy, the garage owner, deliberately rattled his tool loudly in the far corner, making it clear he'd heard every word and disapproved of the visit. Bragg turned and left without raising his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the can spoke louder than any shout. The town newspaper, the Harrison Register, came out that same week with a back-page story. An anonymous writer dryly inquired whether one stubborn private owner was willing to stand in the way of a bridge that would bring new jobs to the county and a new access road to the highway. At the cafe on the main street, the conversation was no longer amused but irritated, as if Dan were personally robbing each of them of a piece of their future prosperity. Ruth Calloway, the same lawyer from the courtroom, found Dan herself, uninvited, in the same garage where he still worked on weekdays, to somehow pay for gas for the pump. "Do you understand what they're doing in parallel?" she asked, wasting no time on preamble, and spread 3 sheets of paper with her own sketches on the hood of the car. "They're simultaneously suing you for land and building a bridge bypassing you across Widow's Ridge. Litigating with you will cost them at best 6 months and a couple $1,000s in legal fees. Building the bypass is more expensive but faster if the weather is favorable. They're betting on both options at once because they're not sure which will work out first. If they succeed with the second, they won't need the first at all. You'll simply be cut out of the deal and left with a useless piece of stone and a debt for the lawsuit." This was true. Calvin Drake, the consortium's engineer, had submitted a memo to his management back in March, frankly stating that the soil on Widow's Ridge was saturated with clay and would not hold the embankment well during the spring floods, requiring additional reinforcement and at least 2 more months of work. The memo was read, filed, and forgotten, because 2 months of downtime meant the bank would default on its bond tranche, and suing Corvin was longer than simply taking the risk and building. You know, I've always been amazed at how easily the crowd will destroy something it hasn't bothered to understand. The city didn't need an answer to the question of why a mechanic bought a swamp with all his savings. It needed a bridge. And it didn't matter whose stubbornness or whose land it would be built over. The less a person understands someone else's rightness, the louder they demand it be removed from the road. On the night of March 28th, Dan was alone in the house. The radio was predicting the usual rain for that time of year, moderate, with no flood warnings. But he went out onto the porch anyway around 9 o'clock and stood for a long time, looking at the sky. The low clouds were moving too quickly, and the air smelled not of the usual spring dampness, but of something heavier, earthier, a scent his father called the smell of a river about to rise. Somewhere in the west, thunder rumbled faintly, not threateningly, more like a warning, like a neighbor knocking on the door, still knocking softly. Dan bolted the door, although no one in Harrison Hollow locked their doors even at night, placed his father's kerosene lantern next to the bed, and felt that calm that comes over a person when the wait is not days, but hours. The thunder Dan heard in the west at 9 o'clock in the evening turned out to be only the first messenger. By midnight, the rain had ceased to be rain in the traditional sense. It was a solid wall of water, falling not in drops but in sheets, as if the sky had been overturned. The county weather station recorded nearly 4 inches of rain in 3 hours, while the typical April average for the entire month rarely exceeded 6. The snow that had lain in the upper reaches of the Salt Fork just a week earlier melted in an instant, and eyewitnesses say the river was rising before their very eyes. The mark on the old railroad pier near town was sinking, literally an inch an hour. At the construction camp on Widow's Ridge, the first to feel the effects were the horses and dogs kept with the equipment. They began howling and straining at their leashes long before the first person awoke to the roar of the water. By 1 a.m., Foreman Wes Tilley had put the entire camp on alert. The water was eroding the temporary access road to the embankment faster than anyone had anticipated, and the trucks scheduled to deliver aggregate before dawn found themselves trapped on the washed-out road with no way to turn around. It was then, between 2 and 3 in the morning, that the previously depicted event occurred. 10,000 tons of fresh fill, not yet fully settled and compacted, began to slide downwards in a single liquid layer, dragging down a grader, a stack of lumber, and a section of the temporary overpass where workers had been standing the day before. The collapse, according to Drake, lasted no more than 40 seconds, and those 40 seconds cost the consortium more than 3 months of regular work. In a large house on a hill 3 miles from the construction site, Hollis Bragg sat at his desk in a robe, surrounded by phone books and a bond tranche schedule. 11 days remained until the quarter's close. If the tranche didn't close on time, the bank would lose its preferential refinancing rate and automatically pay a penalty premium, almost $400,000 extra, regardless of whether the construction moved an inch. Bragg called the state office, called the insurance agent, even called St. Louis, his old bond partner, and each time heard the same thing. Wait until morning, nothing would be clear before then anyway. The route map, the one with the blue mark, option A, lay unfolded on the table in front of him, and for the first time in 8 months he seemed to look at it not as a banker, but as a man who realized that the money he had saved on litigation was now costing him much more. But the disaster wasn't limited to the embankment alone. The old wooden bridge over the Salt Fork River, the very one the new highway was supposed to replace, the very one the entire town had used for the past 40 years, was buffeted by debris floating down the river. Logs, pieces of formwork, even an entire road sign from the embankment crashed into its supports one after another. By 4 in the morning, the bridge deck began to vibrate noticeably under the wheels, even at low speeds, and the county sheriff stationed a patrol car at the entrance, turning away anyone attempting to cross. Several trucks from Hutch's farm, attempting to transport cattle up the road before the road was closed, were turned back just minutes before the deck was deemed unsafe. Historian Arthur Lane, in his dissertation Rivers and Collapse, Infrastructure Disasters of the Ozarks, defended many years later at the State University, described a virtually identical flood in 1913, which swept away a similar hastily constructed railroad embankment near Springdale. Back then, engineers had also saved a month on compacting the soil, hoping for a dry spring. Lane wrote that such collapses were almost never accidents of nature. They were accidents of calculation, disguised as vagaries of the weather. By 5 in the morning, the water had risen so high it flooded low-lying farms on both sides of the river. Half of Hutch's barn was flooded, and he spent the entire night leading his cattle to higher ground, neck deep in frigid water, cursing and swearing at the sky in terms he'd never uttered before in Harrison Hollow. City officials turned on the courthouse siren, the same one they hadn't heard since the war, and the low, drawn-out sound drifted over the flooded valley until dawn, as if the night itself were moaning in pain. And upstream, where the limestone bend met the first floodwaters head-on, in a stretch of land the entire town considered a useless swamp, something completely opposite to what was happening on Widow's Ridge was happening. As the torrent hit Dan's embankment at full speed, for a second, literally, a brief breath, everything around froze, as if the river had paused to catch its breath before deciding who was boss. What was supposed to break did not break, and that was the most frightening sight of that night. The water struck Dan's new embankment with the same force that had swept away the fill at Widow's Ridge 2 hours earlier. The same flow, the same speed, the same amount of silt and debris. But instead of creeping and settling, the soil at the bend held firm, as if it hadn't noticed the impact. The surface foamed slightly. The water curved around the protruding edge of the foundation, found the old, deeper channel and rushed there, to where it had been meant to flow for the past several thousand years, along a channel that Dan had essentially rediscovered rather than tried to outwit. If anyone had been standing there with a flashlight at that moment, and Dan was there, they would have seen a simple, brutal truth that the consortium's engineers knew in theory, but had never incorporated into their calculations. Water doesn't destroy what it allows to flow freely. It destroys what tries to stop it by force, where the soil isn't suitable. Beneath the layer of silt and clay that Dan had cleared with his auger back in March lay a limestone slab, by his own measurements, between 4 and 7 feet thick, solid, without cracks or voids, capable of supporting a weight many times greater than what the swollen river was currently bearing down on it. The fill he was building on top of this slab required no deep reinforcement. It simply needed to cling to what lay beneath it, like a house clings to its foundation, rather than attempt to resist the weight of the water on its own, as the clay fill on Widow's Ridge attempted, even though it had no such support underneath. Dan also calculated the slope angle, gentle, half as gentle as the one the consortium used on its site, precisely so that the rising water would spread out in a wide arc rather than slamming perpendicularly into the wall. His father called this technique slapping the river instead of hitting it, letting it slide, losing speed, dispersing its force over a wide surface rather than absorbing the impact at a single point and hoping that point would hold. A simple idea that had lain for years on the pages of an old notebook, of no interest to any engineer with a Moscow diploma, because it required no formula, only observation of how water behaves when no one is rushing it. In 3 hours, the water had risen nearly 6 feet. Dan had chalked the level on a pile he'd driven in back in March, and by 4 in the morning, the chalk marks were stacked one above the other, almost to the very top of the pile. On any ordinary earthen embankment, such a rise would have signified one of two classic collapse scenarios, which my father described in his notebook in simple terms, without any engineering jargon. Either the water finds a weak spot and slowly, imperceptibly gnaws away a cavity within the embankment until the top layer collapses completely in a second, or it simply flows over the crest and tears away the slope in layers, like a knife cutting through butter. It was precisely the latter scenario, only more brutal and rapid, that occurred on Widow's Ridge. At Toller's Bend, neither scenario had a chance to occur. Water physically could not find a cavity where solid rock lay beneath the clay, and it could not erode the slope, which was too shallow and too wide to gather enough force to strike at one point. All night Dan sat on an overturned box at the foot of the embankment, holding the lantern across his lap, rising every 20 minutes to walk along the ridge and check with his hands for any cracks or dips. The cold was bone-chilling, his cloak had long since soaked through, and his fingers had lost so much feeling that he had to strike a match several times just to make sure they still obeyed him. The fear lingered until dawn, not the fear of the river, but that quieter, more debilitating fear that somewhere in his father's calculations, made 30 years ago by eye and memory, there might be a single error lurking, capable of erasing 8 months of labor in a single night. This fear only subsided when the sky in the east began to gray, and the embankment beneath his hands remained as dry and hard to the touch as on the first day, when he had first finished laying it. By dawn, when the rain had begun to ease and the eastern sky had lightened to a dirty gray, Dan's embankment stood as it had the night before, wet, splattered with mud, but intact, without a single crack or dislodged stone. He couldn't believe his own eyes at first, and walked around the perimeter 3 times, checking every yard of the slope with his hands, before allowing himself to sit on the overturned bucket and simply breathe, feeling the tension of the last 8 months slowly drain from his body. You know, I can only guess what was going through his mind at that moment. Not the joy of victory, but rather the relief of a man who had been terrified of failing to meet his late father's calculations all along, and now finally saw that they had passed the test chosen by nature itself, not a committee of experts. But just as Dan allowed himself this moment of peace, a desperate knock came from the washed-out road leading to his property, not the confident knock of a neighbor stopping by on business, but the hurried, almost panicked thump of a fist on the fence boards, as if the person on the other side was afraid they wouldn't hear him and wouldn't have time to open the door. Dan picked up his lantern and followed the sound, not yet realizing that standing there, knee-deep in mud, hatless, and without his usual condescending smile, was the very man who, a week ago, had tried to take his land away through the courts. Hollis Bragg, the bank president, who had been talking to Dan for 8 months in the tone of a man explaining the obvious to a child, stood in the doorway, hatless, coatless, wearing only wet trousers and a shirt, shaking either from cold or from fear, or from both. "There are people there, Corwin," he said before Dan could ask anything. "On the ridge. 6 in an office trailer. The water's gone around it. The sheriff's closed the old bridge over the Salt Fork. The deck won't hold the truck. The only road left above water runs through your property. I need your truck and winch, and I need you, because no one else in town knows the river like you do." Dan didn't bother reminding him about the letter threatening legal action, or demanding a response, or even putting on a dry shirt. He silently unhooked a bundle of ropes from a nail in the shed, checked the truck's gas tank, and nodded for Bragg to get in. The entire conversation took less than a minute. The road through Toller Bend, the very one the whole town had laughed at for 8 months, turned out to be the only thoroughfare in the entire area untouched by the flood. Solid, dry, laid directly on the limestone slab that supported the embankment. The truck passed where any other vehicle would have been stuck up to its axles. They reached the trailer on Widow's Ridge at 7 in the morning. 6 workers, including Calvin Drake himself, had spent the night on the roof of the office, taking turns bailing out the water that was flooding the lower level, watching it rise inch by inch toward the floor. Dan secured the rope to the base of the trailer, turned the truck around, and, without a word, began to pull. Halfway through, the rope suddenly sagged and slid down a wet boulder. Dan jerked the truck to a stop, jumped into waist-deep water, and slung the rope over a ledge with his hands to keep it from slipping again before continuing to pull. For a few seconds, no one on the roof breathed, watching a man chest-deep in cold water fumble with the rope in complete darkness. Then the trailer rocked and began to move, and one by one, the 6 workers emerged onto dry land, wet, shivering, but alive. Drake, the last to descend, met Dan's gaze for a second and said nothing. He simply silently squeezed his hand a little longer than a normal handshake required. By midday, news of the rescue had spread across the city faster than the collapse of the makeshift dam a month earlier. The same people who had laughed in the courtroom over the $8,000 purchase were now recounting how mechanic Corvin, single-handedly and without assistance, had pulled 6 consortium workers from the roof of a sinking trailer, and they were telling it without a hint of mockery in their voices. When the last worker was lifted off the roof, Bragg, who had remained silent until that moment, sank down onto the running board of the truck and sat there for a long time, looking out over the flooded valley, the crumbling embankment, and the old bridge that might have to be closed for good tomorrow. "I was wrong about your land, Corvin," he said finally without looking up. "I'll admit it to you and anyone else, if necessary in court. What do you want for it now?" Dan didn't answer right away. He looked at the river, which flowed calmly, as if it hadn't been the one that had rewritten the destinies of others the previous night. "A fair price," he finally said, "and a promise that the bridge will be built the way it should be built, not the cheapest and fastest way. I want Drake's note about the soil on the ridge to finally be read properly, not filed away." You know, I'm always amazed at how quickly a person's arrogance melts away when the conversation turns not to a balance sheet on paper, but to their own lives and the lives of those around them. For 8 months, Bragg believed he was talking to a foolish boy who had bought a swamp. That morning, he was talking to the only person in the area who was smart enough to distrust someone else's laughter more than his own hands. The storm finally died down on the 5th day. The city took to the streets and froze. The familiar landscape no longer existed. Not the old bridge, which the commission had declared unsafe by the evening, not half the embankment on the ridge, not the lower fields near Hatch, which had become one continuous lake. But the biggest surprise awaited the county not that day, but the following morning, when a state inspector sent to investigate the incident descended into the quarry at Toller Bend and realized he was looking not at a byproduct of the flood, but at the finished, weather-tested foundation of a future bridge. A week after the flood, the county looked as if someone had drawn a black line across the map, separating those who had lost everything from the one person who had lost nothing. Widow's Ridge was a scorched wasteland, an abandoned grader stuck in the mud, the remains of a trestle scattered a quarter-mile downstream, and a hole that had to be filled in from scratch. Hatch and 3 other farms had their lower fields underwater for 2 weeks, and the state assessor estimated losses of $110,000 in crops alone, not counting the fence, barn, and granary. The old bridge over Salt Fork was declared unsafe by the commission and permanently closed to truck traffic for 2 weeks. The city was forced to haul freight a 20-mile detour. Hutch himself, who showed up to Dan a few days later with a jar of apple jam in his hands, an awkward, clumsy gesture of reconciliation from the man who had been teasing him for 6 months as Career Corvin, only said, standing at the gate and looking at the ground, "I was wrong. Sorry about all this talk about frogs." Dan silently accepted the can and shook his hand, asking for nothing more. and at Toller Bend stood a finished, dry, nature-tested embankment, the foundation of the future bridge, which the consortium only had to build up with concrete. State geologist Margaret Foss, who had arrived from the state capital specifically to compile the official report, spent 2 days at the site, comparing her own instrument measurements with the notes in Silas Corwin's notebook, which Dan silently placed on the table before her. "In 20 years of work, I've hardly seen a single private owner who understood the geology of his property better than a qualified engineer," she said, closing the notebook and carefully running her finger along the frayed spine. "Where did he learn this, without any education?" "In the field, ma'am," Dan replied. 30 years of observation instead of 1 semester in the classroom." Foss smiled and said nothing more, but in her report to the State Department, she wrote almost the same sentence as she had written to Dan. The document deserved a place in an archive, not in an attic. Bragg reported to the bank's board in a dry, businesslike tone, never mentioning his own nighttime panic on Corwin's doorstep. But at the very end, he added one phrase which the secretary, for some reason, wrote down word for word in the minutes. "It would have been cheaper to trust him on the first day than to learn it at a cost of $2 million. The board of directors chose not to comment on this phrase. The final figures were quickly tallied. The consortium spent just over $2 million on the failed embankment and its aftermath, not counting the penalty bond premium that Bragg's bank was ultimately forced to pay for the delay. Dan received $240,000 for his site and access rights, a sum he could not have imagined even a year ago, plus a separate consultant's fee for the duration of construction, since not a single engineer in the consortium dared argue with a man whose method had held up where their own calculations had failed. A decade later, the Toller Bend case was featured as a chapter in Professor Walter Green's engineering handbook, Road Foundations, Practice and Failure, as an example of how one determined individual's field observations could be more accurate than an official geological survey carried out in a hurry and on a shoestring budget. The whole town celebrated the bridge's salvation and the closing of the deal, but when the state surveyor looked into the old barn on Dan's property the next day, the place where, in addition to tools, his father's blueprints and bundles of old letters were kept, he realized that this season's triumph was only the tip of the iceberg. Pinned to the barn wall with a rusty nail was a map of the entire Salt Fork Valley, on which Silas Corwin had marked 4 more dots with a similar notation, firm, dozens of miles up and down the river, in places where the state would still be building many years in the future. Dan stood nearby, looking at the same map, his thoughts far beyond a single bridge. 10 years later, on the day the Toller Bend Bridge opened, Dan Corwin stood by the brand-new concrete pier, set on the exact limestone slab he'd first struck with his auger on a cold March morning, and listened to the state governor deliver a speech about progress and county unity, without once mentioning the flood, the lawsuit, or the night it was all decided. Harrison Hollow was unrecognizable 10 years later. The new highway, the reason for all this, had brought 3 small factories into town and doubled the number of retail establishments on Main Street. That same useless valley now appeared on road maps as the hub of an entire region. The crowd at the ribbon was 3 times larger than what had ever gathered in the county courtroom 10 years earlier. But now people were there not to laugh, but to take photos with the bridge that fed them. Next to Dan stood Ruth, his wife, the same lawyer who had once been the first to spot something more than a town eccentric in the courtroom, and who, 2 years after the flood, had begun managing not only his land affairs, but also their life together. On his other hand, holding his son's hand, Silas Jr., named after his grandfather, a 10-year-old boy whom his father had only allowed the previous evening to hold that very same leather notebook, its creases scuffed to a shine. "Is this all because of this book?" his son asked, leafing through the small, cramped handwriting that even Dan himself had struggled to decipher as a child. "Because of her and because I believed her more than the laughter of the whole town," Dan answered. In the crowd right at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Dan spotted Calvin Drake, no longer a consortium engineer, but an assistant professor of civil engineering at the State University, who had arrived for the ceremony along with a group of his third-year students. Drake incorporated the Toller Bend incident into his own curriculum just a year after the flood. He took students to the site itself, showed them the chalk marks on the old piling that Dan had never bothered to erase, and explained how careful depth marking was more important than any diploma awarded for theory lectured in a classroom. In his short monograph, Field Observation versus Armchair Calculation, published 6 years after the bridge's opening, Drake directly cited Silas Corwin's notebook as an example of the method that, by his own admission, no university had ever taught him. Hollis Bragg wasn't at the ceremony. He'd left the bank 3 years earlier, not acrimoniously, but quietly, handing over the business to a young successor. And rumor has it that he kept one thing in his office at the dacha until his death, a clipping from the Harrison Register about the collapse of the Widow's Ridge embankment, unframed, simply tucked into the top drawer of his desk. No one in town ever knew for sure why he kept the clipping, as a reminder of his own mistake, or as a rare instance of life teaching him a lesson for less than he deserved. Dan squatted next to his son and showed him the fresh granite plaque at the entrance to the bridge. Small, without any pretentious words, simply, "Foundation surveyed and laid according to the geodetic records of S. Corwin, 1956. Dan's name wasn't on the plaque, and he seemed quite pleased with that. It was more important to him that his father's name remained there than his own. "Someday," he said to his son, standing and placing his hand on his shoulder, "someone will buy a piece of land again that everyone will laugh at. If that day comes, remember not me, but remember that you need to be able to look at the land longer than the crowd looks at your bank account." This story could have ended here, to applause and the sound of a ribbon being cut. But rivers flow in cycles. Years repeat the same mistakes in new settings. And right now, somewhere, perhaps at this very moment, stands another person with a seemingly useless patch of land that the entire audience is about to laugh at. The earth never lies. Only the haste of those who refuse to listen to it lies. If I were to take one sentence from this story, I would choose this one, but I would add a caveat. The earth doesn't lie, but the crowd, judging someone's actions by first impressions, is almost always wrong. The courtroom that laughed at the $8,000 was wrong, not because it was mean, but because it judged based on the sum on paper, without a single factual basis for the 30 years of observations of one stubborn bricklayer. This isn't a story about luck or a wicked banker punished by fate for his arrogance. Bragg wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He was a man accustomed to measuring the world by a balance sheet on paper, and the price for this habit was $2 million and one sleepless night that taught him more than 30 years of banking. Drake wasn't a coward or a hack. He was an honest engineer whose voice was drowned out by the chorus of others' haste, and it took the collapse of an entire embankment for that voice to finally be heard. Dan Corwin was neither a prophet nor a genius. He was a man who did one simple thing, theoretically accessible to everyone. He trusted his own eyes and 30 years of painstaking work by others more than the laughter of an entire room. $8,000, which everyone thought was a fool's errand, were in fact a bet not on luck, but on discipline, on the habit of testing rather than assuming, measuring rather than taking someone's word for it. My opinion here is perhaps simple and not very original. I believe Dan did the right thing, not because he was ultimately proven right, but because he was prepared to be proven wrong and still followed through with the investigation, instead of staking everything on one bold guess. 23 drilled holes, weeks spent marking out the groundwork, a cheap dam built specifically to fail and teach us something before building a real one. That's what makes the difference between stubbornness and fact-based conviction. That difference is usually worth exactly what life ultimately values it. In this case, nearly $30 million of someone else's project and one embankment that didn't budge as everything around it slipped into the river. Today, a bridge stands on the site of the old quarry, crossed by thousands of cars every day. Almost none of the drivers know that beneath the concrete supports lies a 30-year-old recording made by a mason who himself did not live to see the day his team saved an entire county. This is how true justice often works, quietly, without an orchestra, revealing itself not in a moment of laughter, but months or years later, when there's no one left to apologize out loud. If this story of quiet righteousness versus loud arrogance resonated with you, please like and subscribe to stay up to date with future stories. And tell us in the comments, was there something in your life that everyone thought was a waste of money, but it turned out to be the most important decision? We read every response. Until the next story, and remember, the most solid ground is usually hidden where no one wants to look twice.